Alright, welcome back to another segment in writing queries with SQL. So up until this point, we've only been querying one table, meaning that we're only getting records from one table within our database. But it is possible to get information and data from multiple tables. And so that's what we're going to look at right now, is we're going to look at joining tables with our query. So let's open this up. So we're going to look at projects. And so we're going to query all the information for projects, and then we're going to retrieve, we'll say, the client name and the employee name that are assigned to each project. So we're actually going to join three tables here. So let's create a new query. And so in our, I'll come back to the select statement first. So our from clause, we know that the from is the table that we want to pull information from. So now, because we're pulling it from multiple tables, we need to include each table. So we're going to include projects, clients, and employees. So previously with our select statement, because we were only pulling information from one table, we just simply specified the column name, the field name. But now, right, we're going to be referencing field names that are the same name in multiple tables. So now we need to start using something that we've talked about a while ago, and that's the qualified column name. And so what I mean by that is that we're going to use, let's say for our client ID. So for our client ID, we know that exists in both our clients table and our projects table. So we're going to need to qualify that. But first, let's add in our project ID column. That's in our projects table. It only exists in our projects table, so we don't need to qualify that. We can qualify that if we want. Sometimes it's good practice to do that. So we're going to start off by displaying the project ID, so we know which project we're talking about. And then we'll display the client ID. And so that's going to be from the clients table. Actually, so I'm gonna kind of sort this by project ID. So because we're gonna look at the client and employee that's associated with each project. So that's going to be the main focus of this query. So I'm not going to pull it from the clients table. I'm going to pull it from the projects table. So after we get the client ID associated to each project right there, well, the client ID doesn't tell us very much, right? So we want to get the client's name. And so we can do that by pulling it from the client's table. And this is exactly why we want to join tables in queries. So client name, again, we can fully qualify it if we want, right? I can do clients like that, so we know. But client name doesn't exist in any other table, so we don't have to. Then after client name, so now we have our client information. So now we want to look at the employee that's associated to each project. So again, we're going to grab the employee ID from the projects table. And so, the reason why we're grabbing it from the projects table is because we're looking at each project in this table. We're looking at all the project IDs. So in order to grab the correct client ID and the correct employee ID, we have to grab the client ID and employee ID from this project table. Because, you know, if I open up the clients table, right, so our client, oh dang it, our client ID, this column is all in sequential order, right? But in projects, it's obviously not. It all just depends on which client is tied to which project. So if we were to grab the client ID from the clients table, it would provide this list. But that's not what we want. We want to get the client that's associated to each project. So that's why we specify the client ID from the projects table. And same with the employee ID. In the employees table, it's all in sequential order. But we want the specific employee that's tied to a specific project ID. So there's the employee ID from the projects table. And then again, employee ID doesn't tell us very much. We want their name. So I'm going to do first name, and then I'm going to concatenate that, which we did before, with their last name. And give it an alias. I'll just say as employee. Perfect. All right, and then we have our from clause where we're using all three of these tables. So we got to include each of them. And then we have our where clause. And so this where clause is where we join the tables together. And the way that we do that, it's actually very simple when you think about it, right? You know, we know that we have client ID in both projects and in clients table, right? So all we need to do is for the where clause, set those equal to each other. So we're going to say where projects.clientID equals clients.clientID. So we're going to look at the projects table, we're going to look at the client ID, and so we're only going to get the records where this client ID column of projects matches the client ID in the clients table, right? Because if we just did the client table, it's going to return every client that's in there, but we only want the ones that are tied to these projects. So we just simply eliminate the records where the client ID does not exist in the projects. So for example, by setting projects.clientID, this column, to clients.clientID, which is in the clients table, now because say client maybe 8, it looks like, is not in here, 8 does not have a project. So when we're looking at the client ID from both tables, client ID 8 exists in the client table, but it does not exist in the project table. So we're going to leave that record out, which is exactly what we want because it's not tied to a project. So that's when we create those orphan records that we were talking about before. So we said that equal to that, but we're not doing just clients and client IDs, we're also doing employees too. So now we got to use our AND condition, and then, just like client ID, now we're looking at employee ID. So we're going to say and where the project.employee ID is equal to employees.employee ID. And then the last thing is we're just going to order it, right? We're going to sort it, and we're just going to sort it by project ID. All right, so let's run this and hope it works. All right, good, perfect. So we have all of our projects, all of our project IDs in sequential order, so that's great. Projects there, 1, 2, right? We got 26 records. 26 records, so that's good. We're showing all of our projects, which is what we want. And then we're pulling the client ID. Again, this client ID column is pulled from the projects table, so this should be the same. 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 6, 4, 1, 2, 3. So let's go back here a second. I ordered this query, sorted it by project ID, so it's in sequential order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, right? The way it's entered in the projects table, it is not, right? 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 4. So to make sure that these match, we got to look at them sequentially. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9. So 1, 2, 3, we got 1, 2, 3. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 6. All right, so that's working so far. So that client ID, again, just pulled from the project table, so it's the same information here. But again, client ID by itself, not useful, so then we've joined the clients table so that we can use these client IDs to retrieve the client's name. Right, so if we go back to our SQL, right, we're doing that by including the client's name from the client's table. So now we're getting all of the client's names that are associated to the corresponding client ID. But again, we're only returning the records where that client ID exists within the projects table. So I hope you guys are able to follow along with that. And then the same thing with the employee ID. We're only getting the employee ID from the projects table right here. And then we're saying get the employee first name, last name. Again, I created that alias, called it employee. Get those fields from the employee table, right? So essentially it's going to give us every employee name that matches every employee ID, but because we're only returning records where the client ID matches inside of the project ID and where the employee ID is inside the projects table, we're only returning those records. So that's going to give us every project, and then it's going to give us the client and then the employee that's tied to each of those projects. So a little more complex than some of the things that we've done before, but this is how we join tables together. So in the most simplistic form, we just select any column that we want to show up in our results. We include all of the tables in the from clause that we want to include. So any column that we select in our select statement, we need to make sure that we include those tables in our from clause. And then in the where clause, we just set each identical column equal to each other. So again, the client ID exist in both projects and clients, going back to that relationship, creating that relationship between those two tables, right? Where, client ID in clients is a primary key, that's the one part of the relationship, and client ID in projects is the foreign key, it's the many part of the relationship. So one-to-many clients and projects. And so all we do is take each end of that relationship and set it to each other, and that's how we join the tables together. And that's all we need to do. Just set the relationship columns equal to each other, and that's it. And so if you're doing multiple tables like this, you got to make sure that you include the and condition, because for instance, let's change this to or and see what happens. Well, now this just does not look right at all, right? We have the same project and same client listed out and same employee, and it's just all sorts of confusing. So using the and condition. Good. Yep. So there it is. Pulling multiple fields and multiple columns from multiple tables. It may seem a little confusing at first right now, but when you kind of break it down, it does make sense logically. And the more that we do this, the more examples that we do, it'll become much easier to understand. So I hope this was useful to you guys, and we'll see you in the next segment.